evening, everyone. Welcome to the Grogan Gallery. We're just going to have a discussion with Matthew Langley and get to know him and introduce us to him. Could you just tell us a little more, or tell us some information on, your education?
Sure.
Stuff.
Yeah, let's start with the I think that makes a lot of sense. So I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. I currently live in New York City. For school, I initially attended Virginia Commonwealth University in the painting and printing department there, and then eventually ended up at B. Corcoran. It was then called the Corcoran School of Art in Washington, D.C. It was connected to the Corcoran Museum of Art. These days, I believe it's part of the George Washington University, free to be honest with the Corcoran. And so that's where I came from. And notable instructors, I had some in both locations. In Virginia Commonwealth, I was lucky enough to work with Bernard Martin. He was just a great Virginia painter, collected nationwide as well, and Jim Baumgartner. And then when I moved up to the school in DC, really back home, for lack of a better phrase, the Corcoran at the time was basically taught by most of the Washington Color School. Little quick art history thing, the Washington Color School was kind of what the artist Clement Greenberg kind of picked to come out of abstract expression. So he called it post painterly abstraction. It kind of morphed into that, and those artists were people like Sam Gilliam and Gene Davis, who I studied under. And Sherwood was lucky enough to work with at a gallery after college, Morris Lewis, Kenneth Nolan, and those folks. So there was a whole lot of knowledge about color, about color field, which is brought into those artists. And what's really great about those artists too is that they didn't try to push out kind of copies of themselves. In fact, they really were trying to push you away from the things that they were doing. They saw what they were doing as their time period. They were looking for that next forward push.
Right.
And that's really good.
And so then those educators that you have, how was that brought inspiration to you and what you're making now?
Well, it's funny because, like I said, when I was at med school with those folks, I stubbornly resisted anything that they were doing. And really, a lot of what they said, I was a stubborn kid, what can I say? But what happened is I found myself in the mid-2000s and going into 2010s. I was painting in oils with concrete scrapers, really thick physical canvases based on the grid. So they were still reductive in a way, but they're very physical. And around 2015, between Christmas and New Year, I cleaned up the studio in New Year and I gave myself just this little thing, like, let's just play around for like the next month, whatever kind of pops into your head. And I started doing these very small 5 to 6 inch little studies on museum board. And I would say within a month, I'd done about 90 of those. They just kind of poured out of me. And a lot of the language that comes into those comes out of really the Washington Color School. Okay. A lot of those kind of ideas about how color works, how it's flat, how it goes edge to edge. What I was able to do with my work is, especially in these kind of small sketches, they have these tops and bottoms where you literally see kind of brush work, how the artwork gets made. So you kind of can see under the work as well a little bit. I find that really, really fascinating. Like being able to look at something going, oh, I understand how those colors came in, how that piece got made. And I was doing that, and so I started to do this. Those were a big, big turnaround for my work as far as really having it seen on a more largely regional, I wouldn't say national, but largely regional scale. From then, those works just expanded and expanded. They went from 5 by 6 inches. The largest one I've made is now 80 by 80 inches, and that's in the Conrad Hotel in Washington, D.C. I've been really fortunate to work with some really great people that have come into my work. And so that's where that initial body of work, this body of work comes out of. I call those, they're basically color field paintings, and I think that's a real great work with them. These are a little bit different because at the same time, I never really considered myself someone who's going to kind of be painting stripes in a way, because they are kind of, vertical and kind of like stripes, but not vertical stripes. And I wanted a way to bring kind of some warmth and some kind of organicness to them, and I was struggling with that because I just didn't want to start kind of scribbling around corner to corner and like having a plan to it. And at the same time, I became really, really interested in Japanese enso drawings. And to make a long story short, Japanese enso drawings are those things you've probably seen at every wellness center in the world by now. They're the Zen drawings. They're an ink circle done in one fold, and they're part of the Zen practice, and they have a much bigger meaning. I can't come to a gallery and say, "Oh, I'm doing these enso drawings. You should trust me that some of them Langley is doing Asian work, it just doesn't, it's not realistic.
Right.
So I needed to find a way to honor my kind of interest in that, but still push that forward. And what I ended up doing kind of is bending my current paintings into these circles, and they kind of become endless in a way. I'll have to admit, initially thinking about these, I was thinking about, there's this album by a band called Kraftwerk. It's called Transeurope Express. And there's a song called Europe Endless, and they have a little graphic for every song. It's an album cover made in like 1970, so there's a lot of money spent on art. And what it is actually is a music bar, but it's a circular music bar, so the music just loops and loops and loops. But that's really interesting. I can do that in how I'm currently working and kind of put these two ideas together. And that's where this body of work has come from.
Yeah.
And those very distinct kind of ideas and approaches.
Right. And so with the shape of the circle, you're going to go to unification, peace and serenity, and then so the colors that you select. How do you go about that process?
I'll admit, the colors for all the work is improvised. There's a lot of improvisation in my work, and I went from someone who rigidly planned work to I walk up to a blank canvas and just start. So I really am enjoying the whole improvisational aspect of my work, and this goes for both color fill paintings and circle paintings. I have an idea like, let's kind of work in this kind of tone. This is kind of interesting at the moment, or something like that. And it kind of wrote from there. So I don't really know what all the major colors might be, if they're going to be mostly chromatic, if they're going to have bright things pop through it or pop under it. They kind of come into the process, and I just kind of let it go with the flow.
Yeah. Right. And so in terms of sizes and your canvases, and what you were saying, you got the 24 by 24s, and then this is the 40 by 40, and then 60 by 60s.
Right.
So that's, I saw some of the 60 by 60s, and there's on the scale of like immersion, you can really step into them. They're great depth there.
Yeah, they really are. I work flat, and I work with a pretty heavy hand, and so I want to use a panel. So I paint on a canvas wrapped panel. I don't work on a panel directly. And so I want something that's firm, and I don't really want to have to go building panels or panel and make everything, so I'll buy a panel or sets of panels. And 24, 36, 40, 48, those are very common kind of acquirable panels from multiple vendors. I only really use 2 vendors for most of them, but they're easy things that they're easy to get. So those kind of drove the sizes. But there are also sizes that work for me. So with the size of brush I have, it goes anywhere from 3.5 inches one way to 1.5 inches other way, and then I have some smaller brushes, of course. Those scales work well for little brushes. And I will say the 60 by 60 inch paintings are rather new, and they are shockingly more in your face than these are. They're just big. And I guess what it comes down to is the way that circles scale. If you've ever had like a plumbing issue where you've had like a 1/4 inch pipe and you move that to a 1 inch pipe, it's not twice as much water. It's like 8 times as much water going through it. And with the paint, it's the same way. So even this, it almost looks dwarfy next to the 60 by 60, and it's only 10 inches or so. Right?
It's almost like optical illusion in the sense of
Yeah.
scale. And the process of how you create is there's obviously different colors within it, but then there's like a gradient and there's a very nice smooth texture that you created. So how are you able to get such a perfect circle?
I make no bones about this. These are actually painted on top of a lazy scissor.
Okay.
And I'm able to kind of manipulate the painting itself in a circular fashion as I'm painting it one hand and the other. Is it cheating? I don't think so, because I think we as humans are able to use tools and that's what we do. But the paintings are all made wet on wet. And by working wet on wet, it allows me to have really subtle gradations. It allows me to build those kind of really quietly ramped up intensities of tone from white to the color coming in, looking out, pushing it back and forth. And it's really, I think, the real secret to the success of these is that wet on wet technique. To be kind of funny about it, Bob Ross also used a wet on wet technique. Now, I'm not doing kind of landscape paintings in his style, but it's a very similar approach that letting the paint sit on top of wet paint so it kind of goes into each other. And the techniques and kind of the effects you get with that are very, very interesting.
Right. And it kind of gives a bit of a shadow as well, right?
Absolutely. It lets you build up, and it lets you bring in something that's, let's say, thin and dark, and then it lets it kind of dissolve underneath if you want to like sit back on top of it with like the top color or even like pale white. You won't completely lose that dark because it hasn't dried up and you can't just like roughly paint over it. So you kind of are pushing it down kind of in parts slowly and slowly and slowly. I think that's a really great example in the painting. It's of course not in our picture over the corner called Wharf. There's a really dark violet circle about 2/3 of the way in. And when I initially came in, it was almost black. And then I was able to just kind of push it down layer by layer.
Right. Interesting. And then the titles are all in those works. So always really interesting. They have quite a unique word selection, I guess.
Sure.
This one here is constant control. And so where did that come from?
Right.
Where did you get that inspiration for your titles? Because I always find that quite interesting.
Let's start general and then we'll go to specific.
Yeah.
So I tend to use titles as kind of shorthanded poetry, kind of found poetry in a way. You know, when you think about titles, especially with abstract paintings, you know, there's always the jokes about abstract painting and all white painting is like a polar bear and snowstorm and stuff like that. And while those were kind of funny when you were 8 or 10 years old, you know, people do look for titles for meaning and work. And I think with my paintings, especially with my abstract works in particular, I'm not really looking to give someone like that kind of skeleton key of understanding everything in the work. In fact, I think that part of the mystery of the work is the viewer's ability to discover the work. So what I'll give them is multiple ways of coming into that work. If they really need to have a title, I'll give them a title. We're going to kind of play around the edges with it. If they're going to come in with color, they're going to come into that color and then swim around in that. And that's great too. Or they're going to look at the round form or rectangular form, and they're going to kind of be comfortable with that. And so I want people to have multiple kind of entry points or nodal points if you're talking about like a database of information, right? And so from there, titles then kind of give me this kind of second kind of, for lack of a better word, meaning to the word. You know, it gives someone kind of a clue, maybe what was thinking, or a clue what was in my head at the time of the work, but it doesn't and never gives the full meaning of the work. So in this case, quantum control, I believe it comes from a song by a band called Altecker, who are in EDM in New York. But I thought the two words together were really kind of interesting because when you really think about anything on a quantum level, having any kind of real control over it's a fallacy, but it's a myth. So you have that. So there's this kind of like, in this case, you have this kind of riddle that doesn't really work so well for the title, but it also lets you know that you can't have that full control. You start pulling the meaning for that together. And it kind of shows, it kind of doesn't really show, it kind of points into the work in that way. And you don't have the full control of the work, but the work does have a life of its own. The other thing I'm really, really consistently concerned about for the work is I don't want to be one of those artists where the work needs like a 3-paragraph piece of body text sitting on one side of it to understand the work. They should almost be kind of instantly kind of understandable. Not understandable like you fully understand every nook and cranny of it, but you get what's going on to it. They should be accessible in a way, and I don't want them to be so inaccessible that they repel as opposed to embrace.
And inaccessible meaning interpretation?
Interpretation, you know, it's funny, we're here in Houston, and I love the painter Cy Twombly, but I think he's a great example of this because when I was in college, the first time I ever saw people almost come to a fist fight about art was over the Cy Twombly piece, this time in the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. And, you know, it was blocks of paint, it was scratches of paint, it was this and that. It was very kind of unbeautiful, you know, and I think there was a lot of conversation about that. In this case, I think I make beautiful objects. I think that's something that we all look for from the art that we do. We want kind of beautiful things, we want them kind of handmade. There's a certain kind of number of boxes I think that we do want a work of art to kind of take off.
Right.
And so there's all that that also work together. And then at the end of the day, it doesn't work for you. And I think that's where it kind of comes in, where you kind of see what it is, and then on the longer and longer kind of looking and living with the piece and seeing the piece more and more, you start to really understand the nuances and what it actually is.
Like introduces yourself
Exactly.
slowly to it.
Exactly.
That makes sense. It's interesting. Well, that leads us to the question of contemporary art, isn't it?
That's quite much.
Yeah. How do you feel about its current trajectory, and where's the future of contemporary art?
I think there's a number of conversations about contemporary art. I think that maybe one of the things that we think about contemporary art, we understand it as kind of one big holistic system, but I don't really think that it is. I think there's lots of other art worlds that sit on top of and around art. And what's nice about that is artists kind of go through these kind of worlds depending on like the trajectory of their careers, right? A friend of mine once described the art world as a hotel, and you start off outside of it, and you're just packing in the lobby, and then you try to work yourself up the floors. But I think a lot of people, the only art world information they ever get is information about the very top, what's it, maybe 10 galleries worldwide that sell artwork that, starts at like $500,000 and goes to, well, I guess we saw a Warhol for $195 million this week, right? So that kind of rarefied air is a very big and very important part of the art world, don't get me wrong. But it's also not the be-all and end-all of the art world. And it's also not the entire art world. So there's other different levels. And there's people striving to get up there. I'd like to think I'm striving to get up there. A lot of artists are striving to get up there, but also a lot of artists kind of look and they're like, I'm such and such an age and I'm not up there yet, and maybe it'll happen. So we kind of find our paths, if you will. And I think that each of those paths are very different. We're seeing young people who are influenced by technology making very different objects. And you're seeing those same objects being made from found materials, kind of like with dead technologies, and having those kind of, I think that's really fascinating. I think that, painting has been called dead since the 1970s, a dozen times now, and I think what's really interesting about dead painting is it just refuses to die. Because I think there's always new ways of making images that go forward. And I think people will find ways to do that, so I don't really see anything dead. What I do find really interesting, though, is where the term sculpture lays. And I never really knew this when I was younger, and I didn't really come to realize it until I was much older, but sculpture and painting sit like this side by side, but it's almost like art, sculpture, and then painting. The sculpture, in a way, kind of takes in the ideas of performance, of installation, of traditional sculpture. And so it has all these kind of subgenres that shoot out there. Painting is just kind of painting, and I don't think painting is clearly the most dominant of them. But what we call sculpture, what falls under the umbrella of sculpture, has such a place to go and has such a wide route that can take you to anywhere it wants to get. I think that's going to be very exciting. I think it's tougher to live with at times. I think that kind of work is really great for museums and public spaces because it can really be immersive. It can be a full environment. It can be this very, very large object. You just can't put it in even the biggest homes.
Right. Right. And it's also kind of, we do live in a sense of a two-dimensional world of screens.
Absolutely.
And so maybe the movement to three-dimensional is the way.
It might be, but I think more than whether it's the way or not the way, I think that what makes it really interesting is the fact that it just has so much width and lateral movement to what gets made inside. And it kind of all falls under that rubric of sculpture or installation or what have you. I find that really, really fascinating. I think that's actually something we've only just started to kind of like poke out a little bit. We do have this great tradition of these amazing buildings and amazing architecture from the Middle Ages forward. What's coming next? Because even architecture almost falls under sculpture at times.
And interior design as well, I'd say. So,
absolutely.
And immersion and things like that.
But to get back to your question, I actually think I'm bullish on the future of art. At times I'm like, art can die and whatever, but it's not really true. Art itself, I think, is in a really, really healthy place, especially as there's clearly a push right now in museums and in art centers to bring in new voices, underserved communities. And I think that's important. If art is truly going to be kind of for everybody and everyone can see it, they have to see it from everybody. So I'm actually very happy with where art is right now. And I think for people who are both making it and who are both kind of showing it and who are both kind of spearheading it, all seem to basically be in the right place at the right time.
It's almost like that structure has been turning upside down now, so that the attention has been on emerging.
Yeah, and I'm not even so sure that the structure was so upside down,
Okay.
but it was just, this is what we knew, and this is what we knew we could do.
Yeah.
And I think bringing in the unknown is really tricky. And I think that's what's happening now. We're bringing a lot more of the unknown, and we're actually, as a culture, I think we're much richer for it.
Yeah, definitely. So then that kind of your journey of this unification of form of the circle, and so where do you see your work going through that?
Right now I have two bodies of work. I have the circles I'm showing you, I have colorful work that I do as well. And I see myself pursuing them directly for a long time. The circles for me are actually very, very new, less than 2 years worth of work has been put to them. And they just have a ton of places they can go. And I'm looking forward to doing more and more of it. It's just exciting.
Well, do you have any thank yous that you would like to?
A ton. I want to thank the Grogan Gallery, of course, for bringing me down and showing the work. I want to thank everyone who has helped me along the way. There are far too many people to name, but it is not without my sincere thanks to all those people.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and you guys tune in and come see us at the gallery, Grogan Gallery.